The afternoon sun hung low, casting a burnt-orange glow across the highway outside Newark. Traffic was heavy but flowing, the kind of stop-and-go rhythm that made commuters impatient and taxi drivers weary. The hum of engines, the occasional blare of a horn, the muted thump of bass from passing cars, all of it blended into a restless symphony of America's East Coast highway life. Inside a yellow cab that had seen better days, Henry Callahan kept both hands steady on the wheel. His knuckles were veined and spotted with age, but firm, unwavering. The dashboard rattled faintly with each bump on the cracked asphalt, and the air inside smelled faintly of worn leather, gasoline, and the peppermint mints Henry always kept in a tin near the meter. In the back seat sat a young man in his early 30s, dressed in a sharp gray suit, tie loosened, cell phone pressed against his ear. He spoke quickly, his voice clipped and irritated. "Yeah, I'll be there in 20 minutes. No, the driver's slow as hell. Feels like we're crawling. Next time I'll just book an Uber. This is ridiculous." He ended the call with an exasperated sigh and looked up toward the rearview mirror, meeting Henry's calm eyes. "Hey, old man," he snapped. "You mind picking up the pace? I'm running late for a meeting. This isn't a Sunday drive through the countryside." Henry didn't answer immediately. He simply adjusted the wheel slightly, easing into the middle lane. His lips curled into a faint, polite smile, but his eyes held something deeper, something the young man couldn't read. "I'll get you there," Henry said softly, his voice gravelly, the kind of voice shaped by both cigarettes long since quit and stories long since untold. The passenger scoffed. "At this speed, please? My grandma drives faster than this." Henry let the insult hang in the air. He was used to it. Passengers like this came and went, impatient, dismissive, assuming his gray hair and slow driving meant incompetence. They never knew, they never guessed, and he never told them. What was the point? The cab rolled forward, the city skyline a silhouette in the distance, when suddenly a sound cut through the monotony. A violent screech, metal grinding against metal. Henry's eyes snapped to the left. There, barreling toward them from the opposite side of the highway, was an 18-wheeler. Its trailer swayed like an unchained beast, tires screaming as smoke poured from beneath. The driver inside fought desperately with the wheel, but the truck was no longer under control. It cut across the divider, breaking into the oncoming lane with terrifying inevitability. Time seemed to fracture. The young businessman screamed, his voice shrill, unrestrained. "Jesus Christ! Do something! Move! Move!" Henry's heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. The chaos outside became strangely quiet to him, like an old song replaying in his mind. His body responded before thought could catch up. Left foot pressed the clutch. Right hand slid the gear shift. Both hands on the wheel. Firm. Deliberate. The taxi swerved hard to the right. Tires shrieked in protest, rubber burning against asphalt. The world tilted as the cab skimmed the shoulder, inches from the guardrail. Henry's hands danced over the wheel with a precision that seemed impossible for someone his age. The motion wasn't clumsy or panicked. It was a choreography, practiced and fluid, born of muscle memory too deeply ingrained to fade. The truck thundered past, so close the mirror rattled from the wind blast. For a moment, the taxi seemed suspended in air, the boundary between life and death only a hair's breadth away. Then, with a shudder, the car steadied, wheels gripping the road again. Behind them, the 18-wheeler slammed into the guardrail, sparks bursting like fireworks before the beast skidded to a stop. The highway echoed with the screams of brakes, the gasps of onlookers, and the acrid stench of burning rubber. Inside the taxi, silence fell. The young man's chest rose and fell rapidly. His tie was askew, his face pale. His hand shook where it clutched the seatbelt. Henry calmly adjusted the rearview mirror, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He exhaled slowly through his nose, the faintest tremor betraying that even his nerves had felt the edge of death. The passenger found his voice again, though it cracked with fear. What the hell just happened? We almost died." Henry finally looked at him, his weathered eyes steady, and said quietly, "But we didn't." The young man's lips trembled. He tried to recover some dignity, but the memory of his panicked scream still clung to him. His voice softened, almost ashamed. I thought you were too slow. I thought you were just some old cabbie who couldn't handle the road." Henry gave a dry chuckle, his gaze returning to the highway ahead. "Sometimes, son, slow hands are the only ones steady enough when everything else falls apart." The words lingered, cryptic but heavy with meaning. The businessman leaned back, silent now, no longer eager to insult. He stared at the back of Henry's head, suddenly curious about the man who had just saved his life with movements too sharp, too practiced, too perfect to belong to any ordinary driver. The hum of the taxi engine faded in Henry's ears, replaced by the deafening roar of a crowd long gone. Memory had its own gravity, and as he steered down Route 9, his mind drifted backward through decades, carried away to the moment when he was not just a man behind a wheel, but a legend. It was 1973. Daytona Speedway shimmered under the Florida sun. The track radiated heat, a blur of black asphalt streaked with white lines, shimmering like a mirage. The air was thick with gasoline, tire smoke, and anticipation. 50,000 fans filled the stands, their cheers rising like thunder. And in the middle of it all sat Henry Callahan, strapped inside his gleaming silver stock car, helmet tucked snugly, gloves gripping the wheel. Back then, the name Henry Callahan was almost secondary. To the world, he was Silverhawk, the driver who seemed to soar through curves with inhuman grace. He remembered the moment the green flag dropped. Engines exploded in a symphony of horsepower, vibrating the very bones of every man on the track. Cars surged forward in a wave, steel predators snarling for dominance. But Henry was calm. The chaos never shook him. His breathing slowed, his mind sharpened. The first curve came like a test, daring them to falter. Henry leaned into it with the precision of a sculptor, his silver car hugging the inside lane. Rivals drifted wide, their tires screaming. But Henry carved through the curve as if it were a gentle bend in a country road. The crowd reacted instantly. A roar, a chant. "Silverhawk! Silverhawk!" It wasn't just speed. Many drivers had speed. What Henry had was poetry. He made the impossible look effortless. Every shift of gear, every flick of the wheel, every calculated risk. He did it with a calmness that mesmerized. Reporters loved him. Photographers chased him. Magazines splashed his image across glossy covers, the sharp jawline, the confident grin, the silver helmet that caught the sun like a beacon. He wasn't just a racer. He was an idol, a face of freedom in an America hungry for icons. Henry recalled one post-race interview. A reporter, sweat dripping down his brow, shoved a microphone at him after yet another victory. "Henry, you make it look easy. How do you stay so calm out there when everyone else is fighting the wheel?" Henry had smirked, tugging off his gloves with a lazy confidence. "Because out there," he'd said, nodding toward the track, "it's not about fighting. It's about flying. The wheel isn't a cage, it's wings, and I just let them carry me." That line had stuck. Newspapers quoted it, fans repeated it, children scribbled it in notebooks. Flying was what the Silverhawk did. The rise of a legend. The 1970s became Henry's decade. He racked up wins at Daytona, Talladega, Charlotte, his silver car a streak of lightning wherever it appeared. Rival drivers gritted their teeth, envious of his seemingly unnatural control. He was bold, daring enough to cut into gaps others feared to enter, yet he never crossed into recklessness. He calculated danger with the instinct of a predator. Off the track, fame followed him. Sponsorships, endorsements, invitations to glamorous parties. Women draped themselves on his arm. Fans shoved posters at him to sign. Kids wore helmets painted silver just to look like him. He lived fast, but he wasn't careless, at least not behind the wheel. Still, he could feel the danger humming under the surface. Racing wasn't a game of if, but when. He knew every lap was a gamble, yet he couldn't resist the call of the track. Each race was another chance to touch immortality. The height of glory. Henry remembered one night in particular, a race under the floodlights. The track glowed white under the lamps, shadows chasing the cars as they sped by. The stands were packed, electricity crackling in the air. It was the Silverhawk against two of the fiercest rivals of his era, Jack Iron Fist Morton and Billy Blaze Darnell. The three of them dueled for hours, trading leads, pushing one another to the edge of control. Every lap, the crowd's screams grew louder. Commentators' voices cracked as they tried to keep up with the chaos. On the final lap, Henry cut inside Morton, inches from scraping the wall, and burst forward like a bird breaking free of a cage. The checkered flag waved, and the crowd erupted. Henry crossed the line first, his silver car gleaming under the lights, his arms raised in triumph as he slowed to the pit. That night, he stood on the podium with champagne spraying, cameras flashing, and fans chanting his name. The Silverhawk had become more than a driver. He was a myth in the making. But shadows always follow. Yet even as he basked in glory, Henry remembered the whispers. Rivals muttered that he was too fearless, that his luck would run out. Mechanics noticed his growing reliance on instinct rather than caution. Reporters hinted at recklessness disguised as grace. Henry brushed it all aside. To him, fear was the enemy. The wheel demanded faith, not hesitation. He didn't know it then, but his downfall was already waiting just a few years ahead, waiting in the smoke and fire of Talladega, in the cruel twist of fate that would clip the wings of the Silverhawk forever. The roar of Daytona in '73, the cheers, the champagne, those memories had a sweetness to them. But the human mind is never kind enough to leave joy untouched. It insists on balancing glory with ruin, light with darkness. And so, as Henry drove the yellow cab down Route 9, another memory rose up unbidden, sharp as glass. Talladega, 1978. The tension of the day. The morning of the Talladega 500 had been suffocating. The Alabama sun beat down mercilessly on the track, baking the asphalt until heat waves shimmered above it. The air was alive with the restless noise of mechanics shouting, wrenches clanking, tires squealing as crews rolled them into position. Henry remembered standing beside his silver car, helmet tucked under one arm, his jumpsuit unzipped halfway to his chest. Sweat rolled down his temples, but his grin was easy, confident, the kind fans expected of him. Cameras crowded close, reporters firing questions. "Henry, what's your strategy for today? Do you think Silverhawk can dominate the way he did at Daytona? Are you worried about Morton or Blaze?" Henry brushed them all off with charm. "Worried? No. Hawks don't worry. Hawks fly." The crowd loved it. They always did. Behind the swagger, though, a quiet unease had started gnawing at him. His last few races hadn't been perfect. He had pushed too hard, clipped too close, barely escaped collisions that could have ended worse. He could feel the whispers behind his back, some saying he'd lost his edge, others that he'd grown too bold for his own good. But none of it mattered once he slid into the driver's seat. The silver car was an extension of his body, the wheel an extra limb. The moment the visor of his helmet clicked shut, the world narrowed to one truth. Speed was freedom. The race begins. The green flag dropped, and 40 cars thundered forward, engines screaming like a pack of enraged beasts. The Talladega track was unforgiving, a superspeedway that demanded respect or claimed lives. Henry's car responded like a predator off the leash. He surged forward, weaving between rivals, every nerve in his body alive with focus. The first 50 laps blurred into a rhythm of acceleration, braking, cutting sharp angles. The crowd cheered his every move, the chant of "Silver Hawk" echoing through the stands. Morton was there too, aggressive as ever. His car, black with a bold iron fist painted across the hood, shadowed Henry like a curse. And Blaze, reckless and wild, kept pushing 3 wide into corners, daring fate to blink first. By lap 120, the 3 of them had broken ahead of the pack, locked in a duel that felt inevitable. Henry could taste it. The podium, the victory, the proof that he still owned the sky. The moment of ruin. It happened on the backstretch of lap 142. Henry was running second, edging up on Morton. The 2 cars were only inches apart, engines howling in fury. Blaze lurked close behind, waiting for an opening. Then, contact. It was small, almost imperceptible. Morton's rear bumper clipped Henry's front fender. Just a kiss of steel against steel. But at 190 miles per hour, a kiss is fatal. The silver car jerked violently sideways. The tires lost grip. Henry's stomach lurched as the world spun into chaos. He remembered the sound first. The horrific shriek of rubber, the metallic scream as his car slammed against another. Sparks exploded. The crowd gasped in a single, unified cry. Then came the impact. His car slammed into the barrier, the force ripping through his body like a lightning strike. The seatbelt bit into his chest, the wheel jarred against his hands, and for a split second, the world went white with pain. Flames burst from the hood. Smoke choked the air. Henry's vision blurred, his helmet fogging, his body numb and heavy. Inside that crumpled machine, time stretched. He thought he heard voices, shouts, sirens, the desperate cries of pit crews. He thought he felt hands dragging him from the wreckage. But mostly, he felt the unbearable silence of realization. It was over, the aftermath. When Henry woke in the hospital days later, his ribs were broken, his leg fractured, his hands bruised and stiff. The pain was sharp, but the greater wound was invisible. Doctors told him he was lucky to be alive. Lucky felt like a cruel word. Lucky didn't win races. Lucky didn't hold trophies. Lucky meant he would live to watch someone else fly. The newspapers the next morning carried photographs of the wreck. "Silver Hawk crashes at Talladega," the headlines screamed. Fans mourned. Sponsors hesitated. Rivals moved on. By the time Henry limped out of the hospital weeks later, the world had already begun to forget. Racing is merciless. Yesterday's champion is today's has-been, tomorrow's cautionary tale. His sponsors pulled their contracts. His team replaced him with a younger driver. And the fans, though sympathetic, shifted their chants to new names. For Henry, the silence was deafening. The track that once roared for him now belonged to others. The Hawk's wings had been clipped. The long descent. Henry tried to fight it at first. He told himself he would heal. He would come back stronger. He would prove them wrong. But every attempt at rehab reminded him of the truth. His body no longer obeyed with the same fluidity. His leg ached. His reflexes dulled. His edge had been dulled by fear he never admitted out loud. Offers dwindled. Friends disappeared. The glamorous parties stopped calling. Fame evaporated like gasoline on hot asphalt. Soon, the Silver Hawk was no longer a hero, just Henry Callahan, a man with a limp and a past he couldn't outrun. The bitterness was sharp, but time is relentless. It doesn't wait for grief. Bills piled up, savings dwindled. Henry needed to drive again, not for glory, but for survival. So he slid behind the wheel once more, only this time it wasn't a race car. It was a yellow taxi. The Silverhawk never had a farewell race. There was no ceremony, no last lap waved on by adoring fans. His career ended in fire, smoke, and silence. By the time Henry Callahan left the hospital and returned home, the world of racing had already moved on. He tried for a while to cling to it. He attended smaller events, shook hands with promoters, even gave motivational talks to young drivers who looked at him with pity disguised as admiration. But there was no return. His leg ached constantly. The doctors warned him that another impact could cripple him permanently. Sponsors had already written him off as a liability. One morning, Henry stood in front of a mirror, staring at his reflection. His hair was grayer, his face more lined, his body heavier. For the first time, he looked, not like the Silverhawk, but like an ordinary man. And in the brutal world of racing, ordinary was useless. Bills mounted. His small savings evaporated. The glamorous lifestyle dissolved until all that remained was a modest apartment in Newark, a few trophies collecting dust, and the gnawing question of what to do with the rest of his life. The answer came in the form of a yellow taxi. The first days behind the wheel. Henry never imagined himself as a cabbie, yet there he was, in a leased taxi, learning the tangled streets of Newark, memorizing shortcuts, adjusting to the stop-and-go rhythm of city traffic. It wasn't glamorous. The car smelled perpetually of cigarette smoke and fast food wrappers. The meter ticked with agonizing slowness. His passengers were not screaming fans, but tired workers, loud drunks, tourists with maps, and businessmen in too much of a hurry. At first, Henry resented it. The wheel had once been his throne, the track his kingdom. Now it was just a job, and a thankless one at that. People rarely looked at him twice. He was invisible, just another old man in a driver's cap. But with time, Henry learned to find a rhythm. There was something almost meditative about the endless loops through the city, the constant hum of the engine, the conversations, or silences, with strangers who stepped in and out of his cab like ghosts. Still, some nights when the streets were quiet and the radio played faint static, he could almost hear the roar of the racetrack, feel the phantom weight of his silver helmet, and remember what it was like to fly. The weight of scorn. Henry's passengers were not kind. Some were indifferent, eyes glued to their phones or newspapers, ignoring him entirely. Others were openly impatient, criticizing his speed, rolling their eyes at his caution. "Come on, old man, I don't have all day." "Step on it, what are you, 90? Jesus, I should have called another cab." Each insult stung, but Henry never snapped back. He'd just smile faintly, his eyes on the road. He knew they saw only what was in front of them, a gray-haired driver with slow, deliberate movements. They didn't see the precision behind those hands, the instincts sharpened by 1,000 races, the courage carved into his bones by years of defying death at 200 miles per hour. Sometimes he wanted to tell them, to say, "Do you know who I am? Do you know what I once was?" But he never did. What good would it do? To them, he was just a cabbie. His past belonged to another life, one no one cared to remember. The double life. For decades, Henry lived in two worlds. By day and night, he was a taxi driver, ferrying people to airports, offices, bars, and hospitals. He knew the streets better than anyone, knew which alleys cut 5 minutes, which intersections to avoid, which diners stayed open after midnight. But in his heart, he still lived on the racetrack. Sometimes he'd catch a televised race on the diner TV and feel his chest tighten. He watched the new generation of drivers, young, brash, fearless, and recognized pieces of himself in them. Yet none of them moved like he once had. None of them flew the way the Hawk had flown. Late at night, alone in his apartment, Henry would take down one of his old helmets from the shelf. The silver paint was chipped, the visor scratched, but when he held it in his hands, he could almost feel the wheel beneath him again. He'd close his eyes and hear the crowd, smell the fuel, taste the adrenaline. For a few moments, he wasn't a cabbie. He was Silver Hawk again. And then the moment would pass, and the helmet would go back on the shelf. Invisible but not broken. The years passed quickly. One decade slipped into another. His hair turned fully white. His back stiffened. Passengers called him Grandpa or Old Man, never knowing they were speaking to a man who once owned the racetrack. And yet, Henry did not break. There was still pride in the way he drove. Every lane change was deliberate, every stop calculated, every route chosen with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed GPS. Younger cabbies respected his uncanny ability to avoid accidents, to sense trouble before it happened. "Old Hawkeyes," one dispatcher had once muttered without knowing the irony. Henry didn't need the world's recognition anymore. He had made peace with obscurity, or at least he thought he had, because life, in its strange way, wasn't done with him yet. The silence inside the cab was so thick it seemed to muffle the world outside. The 18-wheeler had ground to a halt against the guardrail behind them, smoke rising into the dusky sky. Traffic crawled past, horns blaring in irritation, but inside the yellow taxi the air was frozen, heavy with disbelief. Henry Callahan's hands rested loosely on the wheel, the veins along his knuckles still throbbing with the pulse of adrenaline. He did not tremble. He had not panicked. Instead, he exhaled slowly, letting the breath leave him like smoke from an engine finally cooling. Behind him, the young businessman pressed both palms to his knees, his chest heaving as though he had run a marathon. His expensive suit jacket was rumpled, his tie half loosened, sweat dripping from his temple. He stared at the back of Henry's head, his mouth opening, closing, trying to find words. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. You just saved us. If you hadn't, we'd be dead." Henry's eyes flicked briefly to the rearview mirror. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried the calm of someone who had seen far worse. "We're alive. That's what matters." The passenger swallowed hard. The arrogance that had colored his words earlier was gone, replaced by awe, shame, and something close to fear. He shook his head. I thought you were just some slow old man. I even called my buddy, told him you drove like a snail. God." His voice faltered. "I'm sorry." Henry gave the faintest smile, the corners of his mouth tugging upward. Sometimes the ones who drive slow are the ones who already know what happens when you go too fast. The line hung in the air like a riddle. The young man frowned, sensing the weight behind the words, but not yet understanding. The arrival of the police. Blue and red lights painted the highway as police cruisers and paramedics pulled up to the wreck. Officers rushed to check the truck driver, who was shaken but alive. One officer, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, walked toward the taxi to make sure the passengers were unharmed. Henry rolled down his window. "We're fine," he said simply. The officer leaned in, squinting at the driver. His brow furrowed. Then his eyes widened. "No way!" He stepped back, as though struck by recognition. You're Henry Callahan, aren't you? Silverhawk?" The young passenger blinked, confused. "Silver... who?" The officer ignored him, his face lit with the kind of astonishment reserved for childhood heroes. "I had your poster in my room when I was a kid. I watched you win Daytona in '74. My old man took me to Talladega. I saw your crash. We thought you were gone." He shook his head in disbelief. "What the hell are you doing driving a cab?" The businessman's jaw dropped. He looked from the officer to Henry, searching for denial, some correction. But Henry only chuckled softly. "Life doesn't always take you where you expect," he said. The officer stared at him with reverence, like a child meeting a myth brought to life. Silver Hawk, behind the wheel of a taxi. He let out a low whistle. "I can't believe it." The passengers awakening. In the back seat, the young man was silent, his mind reeling. The name meant nothing to him at first, but as the officer spoke with awe, as fragments of history surfaced, Daytona, Talladega, the Hawk, realization dawned. This wasn't just an old cabbie. This was a man who had once been a god of speed, a legend etched into the annals of American racing. Shame burned in the young man's chest. He thought of every word he had hurled earlier, every sneer, every impatient sigh. He had mocked a giant, ignorant of the history sitting 3 feet in front of him. Leaning forward, his voice low, sincere, he said, "Mr. Callahan, I owe you my life, and an apology I don't even know how to give. I had no idea who you were." Henry didn't turn. His gaze stayed fixed on the highway ahead, but there was kindness in his tone. "You don't owe me anything, son. Respect doesn't come from knowing who a man was. It comes from seeing who he is." The words struck deep, and the young man nodded slowly, humbled in a way no business deal, no promotion, no wealth could have ever achieved. The road back to silence. The paramedics secured the truck driver. The police directed traffic. Life on Route 9 began to resume its restless rhythm. Henry started the engine again. The familiar rumble filled the cab, grounding him. He eased back into traffic as though nothing had happened, as though saving 2 lives with reflexes honed decades ago was just another part of his shift. The businessman sat in silence, but his eyes never left Henry. He studied the way the old man's hands gripped the wheel, not clumsy, not slow, but deliberate, steady, with the elegance of someone who still remembered what it meant to dance with death at 200 miles per hour. And for the first time in years, Henry felt it too, the quiet thrill of mastery, the fire in his chest that had not extinguished but merely slept. For a brief, shining moment, the Silver Hawk had flown again. A glimpse of immortality. When they reached the businessman's destination, a gleaming skyscraper downtown, he hesitated before stepping out of the cab. He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Mr. Callahan, I'll never forget this. Not today. Not you. I'll tell people. I'll make sure they remember." Henry gave him a long look, then smiled faintly, almost sadly. "Legends don't need remembering, son. They live in the people who carry them forward. You just do your part to fly your own way." The businessman nodded, his throat tight. He closed the door gently, no longer slamming it as he had when he first entered. He watched as the taxi pulled away, disappearing into the stream of city traffic, swallowed by the ordinary. The quiet drive home. That night, Henry parked his cab in the depot, signed the ledger, and walked back to his modest apartment. The streets buzzed with neon lights, couples laughed outside diners, kids raced bicycles along the sidewalks. No one recognized him. No one stopped him. Inside his apartment, he placed his keys on the counter and sat heavily in his old chair. On the shelf across the room, his silver helmet gleamed faintly under the dim lamp. He rose, took it down, and held it in his hands. The visor was scratched, the paint faded, but to Henry, it was still a crown. He closed his eyes. He heard the roar of Daytona. He felt the surge of speed, the wind pressing against him, the intoxicating freedom of the track. And for a moment, just a moment, he wasn't a cabbie. He wasn't an old man. He was Silverhawk again, soaring above the world. A smile touched his lips. Not the cocky grin of youth, but a gentler one. content, grateful. Because he knew now, legends don't die. They only sleep, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And his had awakened, just when it was needed most.